Another terrible mass shooting, this time in Las Vegas, sparks a new debate over guns in America. Can we reach consensus this time? A divisive case from Wisconsin lands at the U.S. Supreme Court this week. It could affect elections across the nation. Patrick Marley reports. And Mary Spacuzza explains why you too should care about what Tom Barrett is proposing in his budget for the city of Milwaukee. All that and more from the best political reporters in Wisconsin today on OnPolitics. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm David Haynes, opinions editor for the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. Welcome to OnPolitics for Thursday, October 5. Well, in the wake of the worst mass shooting in modern U.S. history, our thoughts and prayers are with all the victims of that terrible and inexplicable act. We're going to talk about that today, and we're thinking a lot about this ongoing debate over firearms in the U.S. With that in mind, I invited two of our columnists to join us today. Christian Schneider, who's based in Madison and joins us via Skype, and James Causey, who's with me here in the studio. Chris, I want to turn to you first. You wrote this week that you would favor, as a conservative, banning bump stocks. Bump stocks is an add-on to a semi-automatic weapon that allows that weapon to be fired, essentially like a machine gun. So why do you favor that, and why don't you favor going further than that?
Well, of course, in the wake of any type of shooting like this, we always see people come out and saying, we have to do something. And you have kind of your gun control crowd that has a whole list of things that they want to do, and you have your NRA conservative crowd who says, well, in most of these cases, there's really nothing we can do. In this case, this actually seems like something we can do. The shooter, from what's been reported, had a bump stock, which is a stock that you add to a gun to essentially make it an automatic rifle. Now, people always use scary terms like semi-automatic and automatic. Semi-automatic essentially means you press the trigger once and it shoots once. And automatic is essentially a machine gun. Now, automatic rifles have been regulated heavily since 1936. They're virtually impossible to own since 1986. So what we have now is a piece that can be sold legally for like $50 online that you can buy to essentially take a semi-automatic rifle and turn it into an automatic rifle, which are, of course, banned.
So you'd be okay with that, Chris, but do you favor doing anything else, or do you think that's enough? And I want to get James in here.
I mean, as is the case, what could we do? We always have a list of things, what we can do, what we can't. Background checks. Well, the shooter passed background checks to get his weapons. Everybody talks about the influence of the NRA, but you have all these misleading statistics out there about how influential the NRA is. They're influential because they have millions of members that believe in what they say. So, I think bump stocks is something that we can definitely do, and Congress is even talking about it. Republicans in Congress are talking about it, but we're really limited as far as the things that we can do that would stop, horrible shooting like this. And
we have the Second Amendment, James, that limits what we can do too. Now, you're a gun owner.
Yes.
You are a card-carrying member of the concealed carry group here. But you have some different views on this. So what do you think?
Well, I do agree with Chris on the bump stocks. We do need to get that done. I mean, you could just go online and find them anywhere. And not only with long guns, you could do them with short guns too. And that's really dangerous, where you turn your gun into like a Tommy gun, essentially. One thing that I think we need to do too is go after silencers. That should be something that we should go after, and I don't think silencers should be permitted. I mean, just imagine if the shooter would have had a silencer. He could have just taken out people. People would have just been dropping left and right. Yeah. And nobody would have known where it came from. He could have took out more than 500 people.
So there's a bill that was coming up potentially in Congress this week, I think, and it sounds like now, from what I'm reading, that it's not going to come. Chris, let me take it back to you real quick. I don't think you agree with banning silencers. What's your take on that?
Well, I mean, there's different reports on what silencers or suppressors, as they're technically called, actually do. In the case of long rifles like this, apparently they reduced the sound to the sound of a jackhammer. So it's not like on TV where you see somebody screw on a silencer and nobody can tell they're shooting. It's still pretty loud, and they burn up pretty quickly on a long rifle. Congress has said there was going to be a bill to allow greater access to silencers, and it sounds like now that that's not going to be the case. I think that's probably a political decision on their part, in the wake of this tragedy.
But
he's talking in this specific case where it was a long gun. This guy could have easily put a silencer on a short gun and just been a whole lot closer and taken out a lot more people.
All right, so silencers, you'd be in favor of that. What else would you favor?
I just don't understand, and I had this conversation with Chris offline, how the President of the United States could issue a ban against a country for having people with beards or whatever coming in. We know who those people are. Yeah. And we could issue a travel ban. Yeah. We could issue a travel ban, but a guy could purchase 33 guns in less than a year, and a rich white guy could purchase 33 guns in less than a year, and nobody bats an eye. How is that possible? How is he not watched by anyone when you could purchase that many guns in less than a year? It's just, to me, that makes no sense. I think if you purchase that many guns in a year, some kind of red flag should go up.
So you'd have some kind of
limit.
And
this study just came out where it just mentions that only.
What about the Second Amendment? How can you do that?
But listen to this, Dave. 3% of Americans own like half of the firearms in the United States. So we know who owns the guns, and it's not always the story a turn to make it seem like it's only people of color who are going around doing all this stuff, but. Who are the real terrorists here? That's what we should be asking the question.
Okay. Chris, should we have some kind of limit either in quantity of guns that you can buy or some other way that we sort of limit the number of guns? The U.S. has more guns than the rest of the world, as I understand it. So there's a lot of guns out there. Well, Chris,
right.
What do you think?
Yeah, well, there are 300 million guns in America right now. So, the Second Amendment people would argue that when you start putting limits on purchasing guns, that it's only going to be the bad guys that end up having the guns and not the legal, law-abiding citizens. As far as the Second Amendment, James talked about, the gun people would say, well, there's also the First Amendment. So, why would you not limit how much people can say? Why would you not limit speech? And things like that. So, they're both amendments and they both have the same legal weight. I don't think that I think it's the wrong message to say that just throw up your hands and say that there's nothing we can do. The bump stocks is one thing. If we want to expand the crimes that prohibit someone from, if they've committed them, prohibit them from owning a firearm, I think that's a Hillary Clinton proposal. I think that's something we could look into too. But I think they should be grounded in whether they would actually make any real difference.
All right. Chris, stay with us for a minute. James, last word.
Last word. I don't think the Second Amendment, I don't think our forefathers anticipated or wanted people to have these types of weapons just mowing down 500 people at a concert. I think more needs to be done. And if we think that this is going to be the last time that this happens, we're insane.
Well, unfortunately, I think you might be right about that. We're going to have to leave it there. James Causey, columnist for the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. Chris Schneider, editorial columnist for the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. James, thanks for being with us. Chris,
thanks.
Hang in there. We're going to move on now to another huge story in our state. The U.S. Supreme Court heard a potentially momentous case this week out of Wisconsin. Democrats are challenging the maps that Republicans drew 6 years ago to determine legislative districts. The Democrats claim those maps gave the GOP an unfair advantage to the extent that it infringed on the voting rights of some of Wisconsin's citizens. Patrick Marley of the Journal-Sentinel's Madison Bureau was in Washington, D.C. earlier this week for oral arguments before the U.S. Supreme Court, and I spoke with him about what he heard. So, Patrick, welcome to OnPolitics. A big case at the U.S. Supreme Court involving Wisconsin this week over redistricting. And as you reported, there appear to be deep divisions on this court, with the conservatives sort of on one side, as they often are, and the liberals on the other. That leaves Anthony Kennedy. Any sense of where Anthony Kennedy is on this case?
No, I'd say the one thing you could glean from the arguments was that it seems very clear that it's going to be a 5-4 decision. It's just with Kennedy as that tipping point, it's just not certain which side he's going to come down on. I would say that it appeared that the arguments went a little better for Democrats than Republicans in terms of the types of questions that Kennedy was asking, but I also don't think that he really tipped his hands too much, so that you could really see him going either way on this issue.
Once again, the power center of the court. So what are the political implications of this case, especially for Wisconsin Democrats?
The implications are huge. The Democrats have been out of power for 7 years in Wisconsin. These maps are very bad for them, and it seems almost impossible to believe that they could win control of either chamber under these maps. This case could, if they were to prevail here, a new set of maps would have to be drawn. Those maps would be more neutral. It wouldn't guarantee that they would be able to take a majority. In fact, Republicans would probably still have somewhat of an edge under quote unquote fair maps, but it would give them a shot at, they'd at least have a fighting chance, which they don't have at this point.
What about nationally?
Again, stakes are huge there. I mean, if this case were to go in favor of the Democrats, then the rules would be reset for all maps. After the 2020 census, they would have to be drawn in a new way where either party would have limits on how far they could go with drawing maps to help their party. So it would have a big change there. And conversely, if the state were to win and the Republican maps were upheld in Wisconsin, that likely would make clear that parties can go as far as they want, and it would give sort of a clear signal to Republicans and Democrats around the country that when they have a one-party control of a state, that they can draw maps that sort of lock them into a majority.
So Chief Justice John Roberts seemed to be arguing that one of the outcomes of the case could be, if the Democrats win, sort of a nightmare in the terms of the amount of work that might come before the courts. Do I have that right?
Yes, that's definitely his view. So most cases that go to the Supreme Court or they get appealed to the Supreme Court, the court has a chance to decide whether they want to take it or not take it, and they take a very tiny percentage of those cases. Redistricting cases are different. Under federal law, any appeal must be decided by the Supreme Court. So they have to weigh in. Now, oftentimes they don't have arguments like they are in the Wisconsin case, and they just decide it on briefs, and often with a one-line order that says, the lower court decision is upheld or reversed. His concern is that if the court says, yes, partisans can go too far in drawing these maps, that these cases are going to come up time and again to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court's going to have to decide, in this case, do the Democrats win or do the Republicans win, and that the public is not going to understand any nuances behind any tests that they do to measure partisanship, and the public's perception is going to be the court is in the bag for party X or party Y.
Yeah, so a real concern there. And he's often been concerned about the image of the court. So Kennedy has signaled in the past that he'd be open at least to the legal argument that partisan redistricting runs counter to the U.S. Constitution. Is that correct?
Yes. So Kennedy's position in past cases has been you can go too far, and that it can violate the Constitution when you draw these one-sided maps, but he has never seen a way to adequately measure it. And he has sort of asked in a 2004 case that people come up with new ways to figure this out so that courts could manage these types of cases. The issue here is this new test, this efficiency gap test they call it, a good way to measure this that courts can handle? Kennedy might say yes. Kennedy could also say, we've tried all this time to figure out, and this is just not an area that the courts are to intervene. It's something that the politicians have to sort out.
All right. So, Patrick, when might we expect a decision in this case? Is it possible that they would decide this earlier because of the impact on the elections?
So the head of the State Elections Commission has asked for that very thing, not saying how he wants the case to go, but that he just wants to know what the maps are early on so that the state can efficiently run its elections. But the fact of the matter is the court could rule as late as June on this. That would create great difficulty with setting new maps if they were to rule that late. We really don't know what the court would do.
All right. Patrick, Marlene, Madison, thanks so much.
Thank you, David.
So now I'm back in studio, and I'm joined by Mary Spicuzza of the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. She covers City Hall and politics. Mayor's city budget is still being hashed out with Mayor Tom Barrett.
Right.
City budgets are a big deal for us journalists. They're a big deal for citizens, too, but I'm not sure we often, as citizens, sort of think about it that way. So why should city residents care about this budget?
So this is a tough budget for the city. Even Milwaukee Mayor Tom Barrett, when he was presenting his budget, said this isn't the budget he wanted to present. I would say nobody's a big fan of this budget, including the mayor. It includes closing 6 firehouses in the city. So that means 75 firefighter position eliminations. That's not layoffs. That is not replacing people who are retiring or having smaller classes for those who are coming on. But, 75 positions, even though there are no layoffs, that's still a tough pill for people to swallow. Also, 33 police officer position being eliminated, no layoffs there either, but obviously with things like reckless driving and homicide and hit and runs being talked about in the city a lot, I think that people are concerned when you start talking about having fewer police officers.
Now, some of Barrett's opponents would argue that, look, he doesn't really need to close firehouses. He doesn't really need to lay off all those police officers or cut those budgets. He could find savings somewhere else, and this is really just a ploy to get what he wants.
So, yeah, he pitched a public safety linked half-cent sales tax, saying that in order to maintain public safety, we need to have a local taxing ability where we could have a sales tax maybe for people who don't necessarily live in the city, but a lot of people from around the state or the suburbs who come to the city to go to Bucks games or to go to, festivals around the city, and saying that basically the city needs to have more flexibility. Obviously, he did not get that authority and probably will not get that authority from Republican Governor Scott Walker.
Have to come from the state.
It would have to go to a referendum of the voters, but the state would have to authorize that to happen. And that seems very unlikely with his former rival in the 2 governors' races. Scott Walker still is governor, a Republican-controlled legislature, who are not a big fan of new taxes. Whether or not they're giving state money, they still don't want to give him that authority. So I think that as tough as a budget as 2018 is, 2019 could be worse. And
why do you say that? Why might it be worse?
Because I don't think that between now and next year that the city will get some kind of new taxing authority, or that the state government will necessarily want to shake up shared revenue so the city gets more money.
So these pressures of paying police and fire, the pensions and all that are just going to grow?
I don't see it changing dramatically.
The revenue side is sort of static.
Right,
okay.
Exactly. And, clearly like the new Bucks arena, hey, the Bucks will stay here, we'll have all these high-paid players, but who gets the income, who gets the taxes based on their salaries? That doesn't go to the city of Milwaukee, that goes to the state.
There's a lot of development around town with the Bucks arena, the NML tower, and all that, but some of that is tiffed to the degree that there won't be money coming immediately from that, correct?
Some of it is, or property taxes. It'll take a while for those.
For those to come online.
Right, exactly. Okay. So we've seen a lot of development in the city of Milwaukee. I think we'll continue to see a lot of development in the city of Milwaukee. But the concern is that this downtown development and all the cranes and buildings aren't going to reach the neighborhoods, and that's a lot of neighborhoods are really hurting.
Okay, one more question. Look, we're building this streetcar. It's very controversial. Lots of folks, particularly conservatives, and I think Chris, who was on earlier, and we'll have him back in a little bit, would argue, why are you doing this?
Yeah.
So what if he just said, like Walker did with the East-West Freeway and the Republicans did this week, we're just not going to do that right now.
Right.
I guess it's in the ground. Might be hard to stop, but could you stop and just not pay for it for a while?
So it's in the ground. They've gotten federal funding. The current city budget for 2018, the proposal includes, it's about $315,000 for operating the streetcar, which is supposed to start later next year. There are some positions that it looks like will be streetcar related. But when you look at the grand scheme of things and how many police officer positions those cuts would save versus how much money in federal dollars you may have to give back if you killed it, I think it would probably it would be a loss for the city, where they'd end up cutting more cops.
Over a
probably.
loss, and it's a handful of jobs you'd gain.
Right,
Is
probably.
that analysis.
Yeah, maybe I'd say less than half a dozen. So.
Okay. All right. So, Mary, thanks for that. Now we're going to move on to our favorite time of the show every week. Christian, I don't know if you knew this, but it's our favorite time: winners and losers. We're going to
It's our favorite time when Christian's on, really.
Yeah,
so.
right. We usually talk about Christian when he's not here, but we won't do that because he's here. Mary, who's your winner this week?
Mine has an asterisk because I think Mount Pleasant looks like a winner right now, that they're getting this huge Foxconn development.
Yep, that's the site for the Foxconn.
Sure.
plant.
Yep. Announced this week. We had it, and then it was confirmed, and so that is, that could be a huge win for the city.
So why the asterisk?
Well, because they are committing quite a lot of local dollars. I think it's nearly $800 million. So that's a vulnerability, and that's a risk if, for example, Foxconn starts building and changes their mind.
Now, they're saying in Mount Pleasant that we're going to get all that money back. We won't be out any money because
Right.
we'll get the tax flows from the Foxconn development.
If all goes according to plan with Foxconn, I think.
Okay.
So they could be a huge winner. They could have a bunch of people moving there to work or commuting in and have a ton of growth. Or they could be putting a bunch of millions of dollars at risk that they could somehow lose if things go awry.
All right, so who's your loser?
So my loser, I'm going to say Senator John Thune, a Republican from South Dakota, who in the wake of this horrific shooting in Las Vegas, talked about how people should take precautions and get small. I think that, you've had over 500 people injured, nearly 60 people killed, unless that number's gone up. And the idea that somehow these folks didn't get small enough, it seems a bit tone deaf, and it seems a bit like victim blaming in the wake of a tragedy, where I would say that anybody going to a concert shouldn't be thinking, like, before I go to this concert, what steps should I take in case there's a mass shooting here? That's just kind of a sad view of the world, I would say.
Yeah, well, let's move down to Christian. And Christian, who's your loser this week?
My loser this week is Cam Newton, who yesterday, when asked a question by Charlotte-based reporter Jordan Rodrigue, she asked him a question about running routes, and he laughed at her as if, and then said he was surprised to get a question from a female about routes. I don't know if you know a whole lot of male sports writers, but they're not out running routes a lot themselves. So obviously there are a lot of knowledgeable, capable women working in sports, reporting. So he's my loser for kind of perpetuating this stereotype.
And he's
Not
lost.
too,
Oh, go ahead.
It's
Mary.
not too long ago that people thought it was hilarious when women tried to cover politics, right? So,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah. And Cam Newton.
Some still do.
We might add, lost an endorsement from Dannon, I believe, this morning.
Yeah, who knew he had yogurt sponsorships? So I was telling James before, they should just give her the endorsement now.
Yeah. I'm sure Cam Newton will be okay financially, though. Who's your winner this week, Christian?
My winner is a young man by the name of Bubba Derby, who is a pitcher or a player in the Milwaukee Brewers minor league system, who was at the shooting in Las Vegas last week, and based on several accounts of women that were there, was actually able to shield a few women from the bullets and usher them to safety and take care of them until it was all clear. So we have a hero in the Brewers system. Let's hope he gets up to the majors as soon as he can so we can all root for him.
All right, so Bubba Derby. So let's move now to questions. I think we have time for one. And I might ask you both to weigh in on this. This comes from Jennifer, and she wants to know, she says, as a statement, we need to implement gun control laws. And this is obviously in the wake of the tragedy in Las Vegas. But what would that law entail? What would it ban? What gun would be legal? Why doesn't somebody write that law and bring it up? And she finishes with, so my question to you is, why didn't President Obama do this when he was in control of everything? Chris, let me go to you first.
Well, I mean, that's a reasonable question. I think people on the right are asking. Democrats had full control of everything and, a filibuster-proof majority back between 2008 and 2009. So if they're for all these regulations now, why weren't they then? Even one gun manufacturer that makes these bump stocks that we talked about before has a letter from President Obama's ATF saying that yes, in fact, these things are legal. So it seems like those steps could have been taken back when they knew about them. So we've discussed earlier about some of the things that have been discussed, but in effect, we have the Second Amendment, and a lot of in the case of these mass shootings, there's really not a whole lot that could have been done. Now, maybe we can think of things that can be done to stop future ones, but in these cases, we haven't seen a whole lot.
Okay. All right. Mary, anything to add to that?
I think it does sound like maybe there'll be some action on the bump stock issue. I think the number of guns that this man bought in a relatively short period of time, I guess part of me as a reporter always asking questions wonders if he had been maybe a Muslim, or if he had been African American, or if he hadn't been, basically a wealthy white gentleman, whether it would have triggered some kind of concern or alarm bells. That does seem like an awful lot of weapons to be purchasing in.
What about the question,
months.
though, about why didn't President Obama, when the Democrats controlled everything, get this done?
The NRA is a very powerful lobbying agency. They give a lot of money to politicians, and that with that money, I would say, comes some degree of influence. And it's not just Republicans that they give money to. They've given money to a lot of Democrats, including, moderate Democrats, I think Democrats here in Wisconsin, some maybe Ron Kind, I could be wrong.
Yeah.
Not to the degree that someone like House Speaker Paul Ryan he's gotten substantially more. But I do think it's not exactly always a Democrat versus Republican issue, and there are some moderate Democrats in kind of more mixed districts who would actually vote against it. So, I wasn't covering Congress back when President Obama was first in office, and I wasn't even covering politics back then. But, I think that with an election coming up, that people do think of what kind of district they're representing and whether there'll be blowback for tight gun restrictions.
Okay. All right. Well, that's our show for this week. I want to thank Mary Spacuzza here in the office with me today, and Chris Schneider. Thanks for coming in via Skype from Madison. Good to have you.
All right. Thanks.
You bet. Also, Patrick Marley from reporting from Madison, and who covered the U.S. Supreme Court this week in Washington. So thanks so much, everybody. Appreciate you being with us.
Thank you.